Okay, so activity 10, vessels in circulation. So table 10-1 is just talking about the histologic layers of the blood vessels. So on the left, we've got an artery, and on the right, we have a vein, and they have the same layers or tunics. And the three layers are the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. So as you can see, though, they look just a little bit different. So the tunica intima is this innermost layer here, and it is made of simple squamous epithelium. And there is a little variation with veins where the um, tunica intima comes out and forms these little pouches that create valves. So if you notice this middle layer, the tunica media, which is made up of smooth muscle cells, it is a lot thicker in arteries. And these smooth muscle cells are controlled by your autonomic nervous system, and they allow for constriction and dilation of the arteries. And so that's how they can get blood pumping back up through, your lower extremities and all over the place. Anywhere you need to get blood back to the heart, they'll constrict and send it on back. So the difference is with the veins, we don't have that thick tunica media. So veins have to rely on these valves to get blood flowing in the right direction, and also the skeletal muscle surrounding, excuse me, the veins. So as you're walking and you're moving, your skeletal muscles are contracting, and they are squeezing the veins and squeezing the blood in the right direction. So if you are, bedridden for a long time, or you're post-op, your skeletal muscles aren't contracting as much as they should be. And so your nurse or doctor or CNA, we're just gonna get you up out of bed and get you walking. And the purpose of that is to get the blood going in the right direction up through your veins, so you don't have pooling and the chance of clots. So if you're not able to get up and down, your CNA nurse will end up putting on compression stockings or compression boots, which inflate and deflate at intervals in order to keep the blood flowing up through your veins. So if these valves become insufficient and you have the chance to develop what is called varicose veins, where blood starts to pool in your veins, typically in the lower legs, and they become really painful and tortuous and large. And really, the only way to treat that is to take those veins out, which we have a lot of veins, and we can live without a few of them. So they'll just take out those veins that are giving you problems. So, like I said, the tunica media is this smooth muscle layer. It's quite a bit larger in arteries, which is why when you look at the vessels in a cadaver, the arteries feel more like a straw from Swig or Stodalicious, like the big, thick straws. So you pinch down on it and it pops back up into shape, but you can feel that it's hollow in the middle. And veins are more flat, and they give off a more bluish color, but what you're seeing is just the blood from inside the veins, the red blood that is dried in the cadavers. And so since we don't have that thick tunica media, they're flat and they're a little bit more see-through. So the outer layer is the tunica externa, and you'll see like these little squiggly lines or these little polka dots here. That is the microvasculature to the vessels. So our larger vessels have their own blood supply because these smooth muscle cells and the endothelial cells, they need oxygen as well. So we've got our vasa vasorum, which supplies the larger vessels with blood. And then we've got our capillary bed here. So we have small branches that are coming off of the arteries and the veins. So the arteries, they get smaller and smaller to the point where we have what are called arterioles. And you'll see here the arterioles, they are starting to lose that tunica media. They've definitely lost the tunica externa, and we're losing the smooth muscle cells. And that's a good thing, because once we get down into the capillary level, all we want left is the tunica interna, because we want to be able to have rapid diffusion. So this capillary bed is going to be surrounding whatever structure needs oxygen. So whether it be an alveoli or a muscle, the lining of your organs. So the carbon dioxide that has been released from the nearby structure passes through the wall of the capillary and becomes part of the capillary system, and then the oxygen escapes through the wall and permeates into whatever the capillary bed is surrounding. So this is a closed system, so the only way things get in and out of these capillary walls is through diffusion. So and then as we get a little bit bigger into veins, we end up in venules, and then those venules are going to turn into veins, and then even larger veins, and then we end up in either the superior or the inferior vena cava. And then the tube, the empty tube running down the middle is called the lumen. So this is what the pulmonary circulation looks like. So we've got deoxygenated blood on the right side of the heart. The ventricles contract and the deoxygenated blood is pumped up through the pulmonary trunk and then into the pulmonary arteries. And again, remember they're blue colored because they're carrying deoxygenated blood. And those arteries are going to travel through the lungs and become smaller and smaller. And they're going to travel along what's called the bronchial tree. And so the bronchial tree starts with your trachea. So you breathe in air, the air goes in, through your nose, your mouth, and down into your trachea. And then it passes into your main bronchi, then your secondary, and then your tertiary bronchi as we're getting smaller. And then eventually you'll end up in these terminal endings where you have these little grape-like structures at the end. And these bags here are called alveolar sacs, and each of these little circles is called an alveoli. So when you breathe in air, all of these little alveoli fill up with oxygen. And so we have these capillary beds that are surrounded by these small branches of the pulmonary arteries. And the capillary beds allow for rapid diffusion. The walls of the alveoli are also simple squamous epithelium, so oxygen can get in to our blood vessels rapidly, and we can also pass carbon dioxide into the alveoli, which then when we breathe out the carbon dioxide. So let's move on to table 10-3. So we're going to be looking at the arterial flow out of the heart. So we know that the blood is coming from the left ventricle, which is oxygenated blood, and it passes through the aortic semilunar valve, and then we end up inside the aorta. So the aorta has different segments. We have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and then the descending thoracic aorta, and then after we pass through the diaphragm, it's called the descending abdominal aorta. And when you're doing your traces, and I'll talk about the trace at the end, you just need to say aorta. You don't need to list all the different parts of the aorta. And then we're going to look at blood supply coming back to the heart. So all of these blood vessels, the veins draining the head and the arms and the torso, are going to come back through the superior vena cava, and all of the blood coming from the gut and the lower extremities and the pelvis, they're going to drain through the inferior vena cava. And if you remember, on the back side of the heart here, we have that main drainage vein for the heart itself, which is called the coronary sinus. So table 10-4, let's look at the blood flow up to the head of the neck. But first off, I just want to remind you to get in the habit of saying right versus left and artery versus vein. Typically, whatever we have on one side, we have on the other side as well. But there are some differences, and I'll point those out to you. But just get in the habit of saying, for instance, right subclavian artery versus left subclavian artery, and left subclavian vein versus right subclavian vein. So just get in the habit of doing that, especially on your blood traces. So coming off of the aortic arch here, we have 3 vessels. This first vessel here is one of those vessels that stands alone in the arteries. It does not have a companion artery on the other side. So this is called the brachiocephalic trunk, or the brachiocephalic artery. And since the heart sits a little bit off to the left in the chest cavity, we've got a little bit of extra tubing here to allow for quite a few structures that sit underneath right here as well. So this brachiocephalic trunk is only on the right side in the arteries. So the next artery we have over is the left common carotid artery. So we do have a right common carotid artery, but it's going to be coming off of the brachiocephalic trunk here. So in order to get up to the right side of the head, you would have to say aorta, brachiocephalic trunk, and then common carotid artery. Whereas if you were going to the left side of the head, you would just say aorta, left common carotid artery. Okay, so the common carotid arteries are going to bifurcate into an internal carotid and an external carotid artery. The internal carotid artery is going to pass through the carotid canal, and it's going to supply the inside of the head and the brain with oxygenated blood. And the external carotid artery is going to supply the outside part of the head. So there's a couple other arteries that are going to be coming off of the subclavian arteries that are going to enter into the skull and feed the inside of the skull and the brain. And they're called the vertebral arteries. And you can see them right here and right here. And then they kind of become ghostly because they enter into the skull through the foramen magnum. And they're going to do something pretty interesting in the brain. And let me show you a side view. So here is the brachiocephalic trunk. Here is the common carotid artery. And so if we come back here, you can see this is the right vertebral artery, and it passes up through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. And then it's going to enter in through the skull, through the foramen magnum. So here are those 2 vertebral arteries right here, and they merge together to form what's called the basilar artery, and it runs right on top of the pons. And then we see the two big branches of the internal carotid arteries, and they're all going to merge and anastomose together to form this ring. And this ring surrounds the pituitary gland and the sella turcica, and it is called the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. So looking at the venous drainage of the head, we're going to revisit the sinuses. And if you remember, the sinuses are little pockets that are created in the dura mater, and they don't have any valves in them, so the blood can actually go in multiple directions in these sinuses. But they do carry deoxygenated blood, so that's why they're colored blue. And so we learned about the superior sagittal sinus and the inferior sagittal sinus. So the superior sagittal sinus is going to drain into this little thing right at the occipital protuberance, which is called the confluence of sinuses. And then we have the inferior sagittal sinus, which will drain into the straight sinus, and then that will drain into the confluence of sinuses. And then we will take one of the transverse sinuses down through the sigmoid sinus, so this S-shaped sinus right here on both sides. And then that S-shaped sinus is going to dump into what's called the internal jugular vein. And that internal jugular vein is going to exit the skull via the jugular foramen. So this picture here, you can see where the internal jugular vein is exiting the skull, and it's going to dump into the subclavian vein here. And then we have an external jugular vein that's going to drain the external part of the head, and that is also going to come out and drain into the subclavian vein. The internal jugular vein is a very deep vein, and the external jugular vein is a very superficial vein. And I will show you those on a cadaver picture. We also have this vein that's running alongside the vertebral artery, which is the vertebral vein, and it is also going to dump into the subclavian vein. And this is happening on both sides of the skull. So this picture here is showing you both the internal and the external jugular vein. So this here is the internal jugular vein, and here is the external jugular vein. You can see how they're not as close together as, say, the carotid arteries are. So this is the common carotid artery, and then the internal carotid artery is right here, and this one is the external carotid artery. On this picture, here is the external jugular vein. It looks like this is going internal, but it's just showing you that it goes up onto the face. And then here is the internal jugular vein. And this picture is not showing you the vertebral veins, but you can see where they both dump into the subclavian vein right here. And then the subclavian veins are going to dump into the right and the left brachiocephalic veins. So unlike the arteries, we do have a brachiocephalic vein on both sides. So this is where it's important to say right and left brachiocephalic veins. And the brachiocephalic veins are going to merge together to form the superior vena cava. I'm noticing that some of the pictures from your quizzes are coming off of our McGraw-Hill Connect app. And so I did put a link to it on our Canvas pages. This is what my view looks like as an instructor. So when you click on it, it'll just have you create a login, and you'll want to use your Slick login to get into it. And there you can access the dissection tool. So again, my page looks a little bit different from yours, but this cadaver dissection tool. And so this is what it looks like. And so when I go into cardiovascular and the brain, this picture I noticed showed up on one of your quizzes. And so here you can see the vertebral arteries right here. And then they merge together to form the basilar artery. And then I'm going to show you the cerebral arterial circle, and it's going to change this picture just a little bit to show you that. So here is the cerebral arterial circle. So it looks like they removed some of the brain in order for you to see that. On table 10.5, we're looking at the blood flow through the ventral body cavity. And we start with the arterial supply to the abdominal organs, but I just wanted to point something out here. So on this picture here, here's our aorta, and you can see that there are arteries that are coming off and that are supplying the intercostal muscles. And we can see a bunch of branches here that are going to be supplying a lot of the structures that are here in the thoracic cavity. So just be aware that we do have intercostal arteries coming off. It's not on your white sheets. I'm not certain why, but just be aware that they do exist. But as we travel downward and we pass through the diaphragm, and now we're in the abdominal aorta, we have some branches coming off. So we have these 3 branches coming off of the anterior border, and then we have some branches coming off of the lateral borders of the aorta. So the first little branch we have here actually forms what's called the celiac trunk. And there are 3 arteries that come off the celiac trunk. The first is this left gastric artery. And keep in mind that you're only seeing little segments of these arteries. They're a lot larger than they look. This left gastric artery is going to supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. So the stomach sits right about here, and the left gastric artery is going to form part of the arterial system to the lesser curvature. And then we have this branch right here, and it's going to form this curly, weird-looking artery that's going to go over to the spleen that sits over in this corner. And then we have this branch right here that's going to head off over to where the liver is at. And anything that has to do with the liver we like to call hepatic. And so this is the common hepatic artery. So the 3 branches of the celiac trunk are the left gastric artery, the splenic artery, and the common hepatic artery. And then as we travel down, we run into this artery right here. This is the superior mesenteric artery. And it's important to note that this superior mesenteric artery and all of its branches are going to supply most of the small intestine and the proximal part of the large intestine. So when you're doing your blood traces, that is important to know. And then it's also important to note that this is the inferior mesenteric artery, and it's going to supply most of the large intestine. So I do believe that there is a trace that goes to the colon, and so you'll want to use this inferior mesenteric artery to get to that colon. And so, like I said, these are little pieces of these arteries, so I will show you them in their entirety. But here you can also see, so these are your kidneys, and these are the right and the left renal arteries here. And then these arteries right here, which are also just little segments of them, are the gonadal arteries. So our right and our left gonadal arteries. If this was a male, we would call these the testicular arteries, and in a female, they would be the ovarian arteries. And I believe our trace goes to the left testes. So in the trace, you would want to take the left testicular artery to that testes. So this is a picture of the celiac trunk again, but you can see what the arteries are actually doing. So this is that little left gastric artery, and you can see how it follows the lesser curvature of the stomach. Then it looks like it continues on. But what actually happens is it anastomosis, or it joins with another artery coming off on this side, and I'll show you that artery in a second. And then here we have the splenic artery, and it runs behind the stomach along the pancreas and heads over to the spleen. And then we have the just the common hepatic artery here, which is going to branch off again into a couple different arteries. So the common hepatic artery. So where it branches, it's going to branch into what's called the hepatic artery proper, which is just this little teeny segment right here. And it's going to send a branch down behind the stomach, close to the duodenum, and it's going to supply the greater curvature of the stomach. And this little artery right here is called the gastroduodenal artery. So the common hepatic artery is going to bifurcate into the hepatic artery proper and the gastroduodenal artery. So coming off of the hepatic artery proper, we have the right gastric artery. And the right gastric artery is what is going to anastomose with the left gastric artery to form this complete arc to supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then also coming off of the hepatic artery proper, we have the right and the left hepatic arteries. And so the liver has its own blood supply. It's actually going to get blood from two different systems. It's going to get blood from these two hepatic arteries, and it's also going to get blood from the hepatic portal system, which we will go over when we do the veins. But it's getting its oxygenated blood so that it can function from these two right and left hepatic arteries. So I'm going to go down to this picture right here and show you the superior and the inferior mesenteric arteries in their entirety. So we've cut off the celiac trunk here, and we're missing the small intestine, so just keep that in mind. But you can see here is the superior mesenteric artery and all of its branches. And so you can see how it's got all these little branches coming off that are going to supply the small intestine. And then we have a few branches coming off here that are going to do the proximal part of the large intestine here. So then here is the inferior mesenteric artery, and you can see how it's going to supply the rest of the large intestine here. So they're a lot bigger than they look on that other picture. So continuing on with table 10-5, we have the venous drainage of the abdomen and chest. And so here we do look at the venous drainage of the thoracic cage. We've got these intercostal veins that are draining the intercostal muscles. And then we have this system in the very back of our thoracic cage, and it is called the azygos system. And it's going to drain the chest wall and eventually drain into the superior vena cava. So this venous system back here, it sits just anterior to the body of the vertebrae. It's very deep in the thoracic cage. You'd have to remove the heart and the lungs and our great vessels in order to see it. So this vein on the right side of the vertebral bodies is called the azygos vein. And then we have a couple veins on the left side of the vertebral bodies. There's this upper accessory hemiazygos vein, and then down here, you'd see it behind the diaphragm as well, is the hemiazygos vein. And both of those veins are going to cross over and dump into the hemiazygos vein, which then dumps into the superior vena cava. So the way I remember which is the accessory hemiazygos versus just the hemiazygos is I think of wearing accessories like an earrings or necklace. That is more on the upper half, since you'd wear it on your ears and your neck. And so the accessory hemiazygos is on the top and the hemiazygos is on the bottom. And this picture right here shows you the azygos vein on the right, and it's just labeling this side as the hemiazygos vein. So if you saw this picture show up on a quiz and it's on the left side, just call it the hemiazygos vein. But do understand that we do have an accessory hemiazygos and a hemiazygos vein. If you see it on this picture, make sure you differentiate between the accessory and the hemiazygos vein if it's on this drawing. Okay, and then we also have below the diaphragm the hepatic veins. And these hepatic veins are draining the entire liver. So the liver is going to have a job for us in our venous drainage. Its job is going to collect all of the blood that the gut has used. So it's going to be deoxygenated blood that is full of nutrients and toxins coming from the gut. And that blood needs to be processed in the liver, and the nutrients need to be turned into a form that we can utilize, and the toxins need to be processed into a form that we can eliminate. And so that blood will eventually collect in these veins here, the hepatic veins, which will then enter into our main circulation via the inferior vena cava. So let's take a look at what the system looks like, that portal system, where the blood is going to exit from the gut and into the liver. Before I go there, though, I want to point out we have the left renal vein and the right renal vein, and we also have gonadal veins. So this is the right gonadal vein and our left gonadal vein, but if you follow the left gonadal vein, you'll notice that it actually intersects, it T-bones with the left renal vein. So we do have a trace that goes to the left testes. So you'll take the left testicular artery out to the testes, and then to return from the testes, you'll take the left testicular vein, but then you have to add in the left renal vein before you get to the inferior vena cava. And that only happens on the left side. On the right side, you would take the right testicular vein right into the inferior vena cava, or the right ovarian vein. Okay, going to the hepatic portal system. So portal system basically just means that we are going into a preliminary capillary bed system before we get into our regular capillary bed system that includes the arterioles and the venules and the capillary bed. The preliminary capillary bed system is going to take place inside the liver, and we're going to go from the veins in here that are being fed from the superior and the inferior mesenteric arteries. They're going to travel into this hepatic portal vein. And then the hepatic portal vein is going to get smaller and smaller and end up into a venule system and then a capillary system. And the capillary system, they're going to be called sinusoids. And the sinusoids, instead of going from a venule to a capillary to an arterial, it's going to go back into the venule system. So it's going to go venule, capillary bed, which is the sinusoids, and then it's going to get bigger into a venule, and then we're going to end up in the hepatic veins, which are then dumping into the inferior vena cava. So the portal system is basically an intermittent capillary system that stays as veins. They don't go into the arterial system just yet. So here we have the superior mesenteric vein here. And you can see how it's draining well, it's not showing you in this picture because we don't have our intestines in this picture. But, well, some of it we do. We have some of our small intestine. So it's draining the small intestine and part of the large intestine, and it's emptying into this big hepatic portal vein. And then in the front here, we've got the inferior mesenteric vein, which is draining the majority of the large intestine. And it's actually going to empty into this vein right here. And this vein is draining the spleen. So it's the splenic vein. And then the splenic vein is going to empty into the hepatic portal vein. So in your blood trace, I believe it goes to the colon. And so you would need to take the inferior mesenteric vein back. And then on your trace, you'll have to list the splenic vein before you get into the hepatic portal vein. And then you'll go into the hepatic portal system, or you could say the sinusoids or the capillary beds in the liver. And then you would take the hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava. So in your book, it shows this little diagram of a chair. And so some people like to think of the splenic vein is the seat of the chair, the inferior mesenteric vein are the front legs, and the superior mesenteric vein are the back legs, and then the back of the chair is the hepatic portal vein. And so the way I like to remember that the inferior mesenteric is what dumps into the splenic vein is I think that it's inferior, it's a lesser important vein than the superior mesenteric vein. The superior mesenteric vein, which is not true, they're both important, but the superior mesenteric vein doesn't have to make a little pit stop. It can just go straight into the hepatic portal vein, whereas the inferior mesenteric vein has to make that pit stop in the splenic vein before it can dump into the hepatic portal vein. Okay, here's a picture from the McGraw-Hill Connect. And what we can see here are the kidneys, and this is the aorta, and we are missing the inferior vena cava here. So we can see the right and the left renal arteries, and we can see the right and the left gonadal arteries, and this is the spleen right here. So this is where the celiac trunk would be, and here's where the superior mesenteric artery would be, and here's where the inferior mesenteric artery would be. So I'm going to add in a layer here, and there is the aorta, kind of still buried here. And here we've added on the branches of the celiac trunk. So this is the left gastric right here. This is the stomach that's been cut. This is the splenic artery right here going to the spleen, and you can see how it's kind of curly like a pig's tail. And then we have the common hepatic artery, and it's going to branch into the gastroduodenal artery and the hepatic artery proper. And somewhere along here, the right gastric would be coming off, but we also have the right and the left hepatic arteries. So here, this is actually the lesser, or the inferior mesenteric artery. You can see its branches here. And if I add in this layer right here, this is the superior mesenteric artery and all of its branches. Okay, so I'm going to take that layer away again and show you this is the inferior mesenteric vein, because you can see how it dumps into the splenic vein, and this is the superior mesenteric vein that's been cut. And both of those, the splenic and the superior mesenteric vein, are going to dump into this big vein right here, which is the hepatic portal vein. Okay. So this picture is out of your book, and just to orient you to this picture, here's the spleen, here are your kidneys, here's the liver, and part of it's been removed. Here is the aorta, here is the inferior vena cava. And so let's look at what we can find. So here is the celiac trunk, and this is the left gastric artery, and it doesn't look like it's coming off of the celiac trunk, and I'm not entirely sure because I can't zoom in far enough to see and move this left gastric, but there are some variations. In fact, there's at least 8 or 9 variations of the celiac trunk where one artery is coming off of the aorta and the other 2 are coming off the trunk. And so there's so many different variations of that. There's actually even a variation where the trunk doesn't even exist and the 3 branches are coming directly off of the aorta. So I can't tell in this picture, but this left gastric artery could be coming directly off of the aorta, or it could be attached to the trunk. I can't tell. But regardless, this is the left gastric artery. Here is the splenic artery, and here is the common hepatic artery. And then this is the hepatic artery proper. And then the gastroduodenal artery. And then here is the right and the left hepatic arteries. And again, in this picture, we're missing the right gastric artery. Don't know where it went. But you can see here is the splenic vein. And these are the renal veins. Tucked underneath are the renal arteries. So here's this left renal vein. And I'm not seeing the right renal vein, so they must have cut it away. But what we can see here, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Well, first off, here is the inferior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric artery. But you're wondering what all of this is. And so this is actually the superior mesenteric vein, which has been cut, and it's laying on top of the aorta. So the superior mesenteric vein is dumping into the hepatic portal vein here. And you can see that the splenic vein also dumps into the hepatic portal vein here. But this is a little variation of this hepatic portal system here. You can see here is the inferior mesenteric vein. And instead of dumping into the splenic vein like it should, it's actually dumping into the superior mesenteric vein. So when you're looking at this picture, don't let that confuse you. There's a little variation right there. But you can still see here where the left gonadal vein, and it's labeled testicular, so this is a male, so this is the left testicular vein that is dumping into the left renal vein. And you can see the right testicular vein is dumping directly into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so let's go to table 10-6, so blood flow through the upper limb. So we're going to go back up to the aortic arch, and we're going to go into the right arm here. So if we were doing a trace into the right arm, we would need to say aorta, and then brachiocephalic trunk, and then the subclavian artery. And then once the subclavian artery passes underneath the clavicle, it's going to become the axillary artery. Then the axillary artery is going to travel down, and once it passes underneath the teres major and minor, it's going to become the brachial artery. So we have our brachial artery, which is then going to pass through the antecubital area and bifurcate. And it bifurcates into the radial artery on the thumb side and the ulnar artery on the pinky side. So your radial artery is where you're going to get your radial pulse. And then we have the superficial palmar arch and the deep palmar arch. So if I zoom in just a little bit more, here you can see the superficial palmar arch and the deep palmar arch. So according to your white sheets, the superficial palmar arch is formed by the ulnar artery here. But you can see where it does anastomose with the radial artery. And the deep palmar arch is supplied by the radial artery here. And then it does anastomose with the ulnar artery. But the superficial palmar arch is going to supply blood to the digits, to the digital arteries. And the deep palmar arch is going to supply to the thumb. Okay, now we're going to look at the venous drainage of the upper arm, and I'm going to zoom out here. So you'll see when you're looking at this picture in the book that there are blue, deep blue colored vessels, and there are also kind of a more purpley lilac colored vessel. The darker blue vessels is the deep vein drainage, and the lighter purple vessels are the superficial drainage. So when you're doing your blood traces, we want you to take the superficial drainage back into the venous system. So zoom in here a little bit. So you can see here, one of our traces, I can't remember whether it's either on the ulnar or the radial side of the wrist. So if you were draining the ulnar side of the wrist here, you would take this big vein back. And this big vein has some tributaries coming into it, but the vein itself is called the basilic vein. And it's going to dump into the axillary vein. And so don't get this vein confused with the basilar artery up in the brain. So this is the basilic vein. And if you were draining the radial side of the wrist, you would use this vein, which is called the cephalic vein. And again, the cephalic vein has some tributaries coming into it. But it is this vein that travels on the upper side of the arm. And if the muscles were here, you would see the deltoid right here, and then you would see the pectoralis major muscles right here. And this cephalic vein runs between those two muscles, right on top. So these superficial veins, you can see right under the skin. So somebody that's got, really muscular arms and their veins, they're nice and hydrated, you can see these veins popping out all over the place, these superficial veins. Then the connection between the two is what is called the median cubital vein. So when you're doing venous access, either through an IV or a blood draw, you're going to be accessing these superficial veins. And this median cubital vein is a common vein that is accessed. So the deep veins, so our veins tend to follow a pattern in the extremities where we have two deep veins to the one artery. So we've got a deep venous palmar arch and a superficial venous palmar arch, and you don't need to worry about those. They're not on your, well, they are on your white sheets, but we don't do a trace to them. And then you also have your digital veins. So your digital veins, here's your superficial palmar arch, and then here is the deep palmar arch. And those are going to give rise into our two radial veins, the deeper veins, and the two ulnar veins here. And then the two radial veins are going to merge, and the two ulnar veins are going to merge into our two deep brachial veins. And then those brachial veins are going to merge to form the axillary vein, which is then going to dump into the subclavian vein, which then dumps into the brachiocephalic vein. And we do have a brachiocephalic vein on both sides, so you would need to say, right brachiocephalic vein. So just to make things super fun, there are some variations of the veins in the antecubital area. So the one that we looked at had the cephalic vein, the basilic vein, and then the one in between, which is the median cubital vein. But there is another variation, and I believe our wireman has this variation, where the cephalic vein and the basilic vein, instead of having one vein go across, we've got two. We have a branch coming off of the cephalic, joining with a branch coming off of the basilic. So this would be called the median cephalic vein, and then this one would be called the median basilic vein. So continuing on with table 10-7, we're looking at the arterial supply to the lower limb, pelvis, and perineum. So here is our descending abdominal aorta. It's going to bifurcate into two, right around to the level of L5. And the two branches are going to be the common iliac arteries, so the right and left common iliac arteries. And then that is going to bifurcate again into the external iliac artery and the internal iliac artery. And the internal iliac artery is going to supply the pelvis and the perineum. And then the external iliac artery is going to pass underneath the inguinal ligament and through the inguinal canal and become the femoral artery. So I'm going to go to this guy right here. And here's my femoral artery. There is another deep femoral artery that's going to supply more the posterior part of the thigh, but we're focusing on this femoral artery here. And right about the point where, if you remember, the adductor magnus comes down and it's got attachment on the adductor tubercle, and it created this almost triangle opening right here. That opening is called the adductor hiatus, and the femoral artery passes through that adductor hiatus and it ends up on the back of the leg. So if I go to our leg picture here, this is the posterior view of the leg. Once it passes through the adductor hiatus, it will become the popliteal artery. And then the popliteal artery is going to bifurcate into the posterior tibial artery, which is going to follow the back of the leg, and the anterior tibial artery. And the anterior tibial artery is going to pass through this interosseous membrane right here and end up in the front of the leg. So this is the anterior tibial artery here. And then we also have this little branch coming off of the popliteal that is called the fibular artery right here. So this is the fibular artery. And it's going to supply the lateral side of the lower leg. Then the venous drainage coming from the lower limb. Let's look at the superficial drainage first. And so we have this enormous vein. It is called the great saphenous vein, and it runs just underneath the skin on the medial part of the leg. And you'll see it's got a lot of tributaries coming in, so a lot of drainage is happening through this great saphenous vein. And the great saphenous vein is then going to dump into the femoral vein. So the great saphenous vein is draining the superficial medial side of the lower limb, and there's a little bit coming from the upper limb as well, but mainly the lower limb is what we're focusing on. And the small saphenous vein. So the small saphenous vein you can see from the posterior side. So this one you can see if someone's got a nice muscular calf, you can see this vein running right up on top of the gastrocnemius. And right as the two heads of the gastrocnemius split apart, this vein is going to dive down underneath a membrane here. So this vein in the back is called the small saphenous vein. And it's going to drain more of the lateral aspect of the foot and the back of the leg. And this one is going to dump into the popliteal vein. So if we're doing the deep drainage of the leg, we have the two anterior tibial veins here that are going to pass through that interosseous membrane to the back of the leg. And then they will dump into the popliteal vein. Then we have the two fibular veins that are draining the lateral compartment of the leg. And they are actually going to dump into the posterior tibial vein. So you see here, the posterior tibial veins are here. They merge together. And right here is where the fibular veins are going to merge with the posterior tibial veins, and then they will become the popliteal vein. And then the popliteal vein is going to dump into the femoral vein. And again, you'll see we have another deep femoral vein, but we're focusing on this femoral vein right here. And it is going to come to the anterior part of the leg here and pass underneath the inguinal ligament again. And so once it passes underneath the inguinal ligament, it's going to become the external iliac vein. So here we have the external iliac vein and the internal iliac vein. And then those are going to merge to form the common iliac vein, and then they merge to form the inferior vena cava. So I'm going to walk through the first trace with you. I'm on page 189, and your next assignment, the blood trace assignment, will be you will pick two of the traces from trace 2 through 6. And you will do it the same as you did with the nerve assignment, where you open the Google Doc, you open it as a copy, you edit it with your answers, and then you submit it to me. And make sure when you submit it that you submit it as public to me so that I can actually view it. But here we go with trace 1. Okay, from the heart to the medial side left wrist and back to the heart, use superficial veins in return to the heart and then to the lungs and the back to the heart. So you need to make sure you're saying left or right, and you're also saying artery or vein where it applies. So we're going to the left wrist. So we need to keep that in mind when we're coming out of the heart. So going through the heart though, pretend you are a red blood cell and you're going to give us a play-by-play of everything you're seeing on your way. So you start out in the left atrium. So the first thing you're going to see as you pass out of the left atrium is the left atrioventricular valve. And you can also call it the bicuspid or the mitral valve. And then you'll be in the left ventricle. And from there, you will pass through the aortic semilunar valve. And then you're in the aorta. So if it doesn't already say aorta, just make sure that you don't say ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta. Just say aorta or you're going to run out of lines. So since we're going to the left side, the vessel that we need to take is the left subclavian artery. And from there, we end up in the left axillary artery. And from there, we're in the left brachial artery. And so we need to go to the medial side of the left wrist. So the medial side would be the pinky side. So we'll take the left ulnar artery, and then we'll end up in the capillary bed on the medial side of the left wrist. So we are taking superficial veins back. So since we are on the ulnar side, we're going to take the left basilic vein back. And it tells us here that the left basilic vein is going to dump into the left axillary vein. And from there, it's easy. We have the left subclavian vein, and then the left brachiocephalic vein. And then we end up in the superior vena cava. And from there, we're in the right atrium. So what structure were we going to pass through? We're going to pass through the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. And then we'll end up in the right ventricle. And from there, we're given the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then from that point, we are in the pulmonary trunk. And on this line, you'll say either right and left pulmonary arteries, or you can just say pulmonary arteries. And at that point, we'll just go directly into the pulmonary capillary bed. And from there, we'll go into the pulmonary veins. So we're kind of skipping the arterial and the venule level here. So pulmonary capillary bed goes directly into the pulmonary veins. And you can say right and left pulmonary veins or just pulmonary veins. And then in the left atrium. So that's how you're going to do your traces. So again, just pick two of them, excluding trace 1 since we already did it, and get those submitted to me when you can. And keep working on your quiz. And I will give you more information on the final as it comes. We still haven't decided on how long each question will be, but it looks like you might be able to go back. So that is a good thing. And then just wanted to let you guys know that I miss you and I miss seeing your faces, and this sucks doing it online, and I'm terrible at doing these recordings. And not that I'm not terrible in person, but I like it much better because I have interaction with you and I can see your faces and I can see where you're confused. And and I can make funny, lame jokes, and it's just a lot better. So I miss you, and I hope maybe I'll be able to see you. It looks like I'm not going to, but maybe we can have a little class reunion when this is all over. So please email me with your questions. I literally am just sitting here waiting for you to ask me a question. I'm bored out of my mind. I'm tired of cleaning my house because it just gets messed up anyway. And so, literally, I just sit here waiting. So, please let me know if you have questions, and I will talk to you soon.